So thanks very much, Liz, for the introduction. I suppose I'd better provide a sort of a disciplinary introduction to myself and what I do. I teach through the Centre for Language and Communication at the Open University. But the research I'm going to be talking about is mostly within the field of the sociology of culture, particularly drawing on the approach to that field that was founded and defined by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. Bourdieu's approach to the sociology of culture combines anthropology, historical research, and quantitative analysis, especially multiple correspondence analysis. It focuses on the economic and para-economic basis of cultural phenomena, looking at the unequal distribution of economic capital, but also various other resources that Bourdieu describes as forms of capital: social capital, cultural capital, symbolic capital, and linguistic capital. Bourdieu also uses the metaphor of investment to account for a lot of cultural processes. His field theory aims to understand the connection between subjective perceptions and what he calls objective relations. His most influential work was Distinction, published in French in 1979 and in English translation in 1984, which was a multi-methodological study of taste as a marker of social status. It started a lot of debates that are still central to the sociology of culture, especially on the relation of cultural consumption to class of status. Got a few examples there from recent years. The last of those, by the way, Savage et al. 2013, was the paper arising from the Great British Class Survey. I don't know if any of you filled that in on the BBC website this year. But that's not what I'm focusing on. I'm more interested in other aspects of Bourdieu's theory of fields. This is described in general terms by Benson as the idea that society is differentiated into a number of semi-autonomous fields governed by their own rules of the game and offering their own particular economies of exchange and reward. According to Bourdieu, there is a distinct field of cultural production within which art, literature, music, etc. are professionally produced. That word professionally is important because amateur artists, etc., are argued to be excluded from the field. The specific logic of that field, that is, the rules of the game that apply there, is explicitly anti-commercial, although only short-term gain is rejected. So the idea here is that somebody who publishes their first book and it's a bestseller, that's kind of suspect within the field of cultural production. That's not how it's supposed to work. You're supposed to lose money and suffer through poverty to begin with, and only later in your career to be recognized for the great artist that you are, and finally to start to get some financial returns. The object of critique here is the ideology surrounding culture. A lot of sort of shallow readings of Bourdieu present him as a sort of Philistine, which he definitely wasn't. As Boschetti points out here, Bourdieu's analysis questions the charismatic conception of culture, which, by refusing to take into consideration the social conditions of production and reception, makes it impossible to fully understand cultural phenomena, and moreover produces effects of symbolic violence, and that it conceals the mechanisms that hinder access to culture, thereby making it a rare good, inaccessible to the majority. So Bourdieu is not actually arguing that we shouldn't read books or listen to music. He's just arguing that we should have effectively a less romantic conception of how culture works and how it comes to have value. I just thought I'd better, in the interest of representing Bourdieu properly, show you one of his famous diagrams. This is how Bourdieu conceives the field of cultural production. This is a field embedded within a field. Bourdieu sees society in terms of social space, national social space, which in this case is France. A lot of his work is very specific to France and French culture, which isn't always recognized in international appropriations of his work. And he sees the social space as having two poles. At one end, there's a lack of all forms of capital, economic and cultural. This is obviously the end of the social space occupied by the proletariat, the lower middle class, etc. Then you get the other opposite end, the opposite pole of the social space, where you'll find cultural capital and economic capital be concentrated. in regards to that. At that end of the social space, you find the field of power, which again is bipolar. On the one hand, you have that pole of the field of power with high economic capital, but low cultural capital. That's where you'll find industrialists in the nouveau riche. At the other end of the field of power, a lack of economic capital, but a large amount of cultural capital. And this is where the field of cultural production is located over here. The field of cultural production is in turn polarized. On the one hand, you have the field of large-scale production, things like mainstream Hollywood movies, best-selling books, etc. These things generate a large amount of economic capital, relatively speaking, but they lack the symbolic capital, specific capital that's valued within the field. As I mentioned earlier, within the field of cultural production, the ideal is to be doing something that's producing an art that is so radical that ordinary people can't understand it. Therefore, you lose money on it. It could gain the respect of other cultural producers. So at this other end, we have the avant-garde, bohemia, etc. With a high level of symbolic capital, and in the short term, a lack of economic capital. The particular aspect of Bourdieu's theory of fields that I'm focusing on at the moment is his account of the production of value, or the production of belief in value. Bourdieu argues that cultural artifacts are fetishes, analogous to religious or magical artifacts. The producers of these artifacts struggle with one another to establish whose works other cultural producers will believe to be valuable. And in struggling with one another, they reproduce the belief that cultural value actually exists, because otherwise, what would they be fighting over? So Bourdieu refers to this process as symbolic production, production of value, and production of belief, using these terms more or less interchangeably. So this is the process whereby you have a large number of people that are producing, let's say, poetry. None of them are making any money, but some of them will be taken to have been producing the really valuable poetry that in the long term may find its way onto the school syllabus. And then that will then generate revenue, because you've got students and teachers all over the country and possibly the world buying copies of it so they can pass their exams. A few quick quotes from Bourdieu. He argues, for the author, the critic, the art dealer, the publisher, or the theatre manager, these are all cultural producers. They're all members of the participants in the field of cultural production. Their only legitimate accumulation consists in making a name for oneself. So they're not supposed to be trying to make money, they're supposed to be trying to build a reputation among other cultural producers. Implying power to consecrate objects or persons and therefore to give value and to appropriate the profits from this operation. Bourdieu goes on to argue that what makes reputations is not this or that influential person or institution, review, magazine, etc. It's the field of production understood as a system of objective relations between these agents or institutions, and as the site of the struggles for the monopoly of the power to consecrate, in which the value of works of art and belief in that value are continuously generated. So it's back to this idea. You have a conflict between cultural producers over whose work is going to be treated as valuable. A couple more little quotes, which are we're now sort of zeroing in on what actually inspired the research that I'm presenting today. Bourdieu argues that degree-specific consecration, or literary or artistic prestige, is the degree of recognition accorded by those who recognize no other criterion of legitimacy than recognition by those whom they recognize. One of Bourdieu's typically, and I think quite wonderfully convoluted phrases there. Essentially, what he's saying is that if you are a participant in the field of restricted production, what you are producing in the hope of getting recognition from other people like yourself. So if you're an artist, you want recognition from other people that you recognize as artists, people who recognize each other as artists. It doesn't matter if whether the person in the street thinks that you're an artist or not. It matters whether artists think you're an artist. Whether the same applies to them. So these are the people that recognize each other and whose little gang you want to join, essentially. Bourdieu also, he draws parallels between artistic production and academic work as well. He argues that status as a writer, artist, or scientist exists only in and through the circular relations of reciprocal recognition among peers. The reason I brought up these two quotations is they both suggest something like a social network in which value and recognition circulates. We'll look at exactly why in a moment. So what I'm essentially doing today is proposing a network model for symbolic production, the production of value, the production of belief. In this network model, individuals are represented by nodes in a directed graph. An arc, for those that are not familiar with graph theory or social network analysis, an arc is a line between two nodes that has a direction. So it's usually drawn as an arrow. An arc between two nodes represents one individual's recognition of value in the work of another individual. These circular relations of reciprocal recognition among peers will appear as simple cycles, that is, paths starting and ending on the same node. So if you follow from one node along the arrow to the next node, along the arrows to the next nodes, eventually you'll find your way back to the starting point. That's a cycle. And more successful producers will be in more central positions in the network. Less successful producers will be in less central or more peripheral positions in the network. This is essentially the theory that I'm proposing. There have been other social network analyses of cultural fields which have points of comparison. For example, the most important one is probably Anheuer and Gerhard's study. This was a survey. They attempted to survey all of the authors in the city of Köln. They were actually able to survey quite a lot of them. They showed them a list of other authors in the city, and they asked them, which of these authors would you like to invite for dinner, for example? Questions like that. Which of them have you heard of, etc. And they found what they described as a core periphery structure, where you have the established artists, the established writers whose work is widely acknowledged as valuable. They're at the centre of this network of esteem. They also found some sort of, at the periphery of the network, you might have the younger artists who have not become established yet. You might also have the older artists who have not become established, aging but unconsecrated, as Bourdieu would put it. They didn't, Anheuer and Gerhard's, they used a form of social network analysis called block modeling, and they don't really engage in their 1991 paper with Bourdieu's work in any serious way. However, they wrote a paper a few years later which does engage Anheuer, Gerhard's and Rommel, 1995, which engages with Bourdieu on a much deeper level, and which actually, it reanalyzes the original data using multiple correspondence analysis, which is Bourdieu's preferred method, and finds more or less the same thing. Another study worth looking at, de Nooy, 1999, he looked at criticism in Dutch literature. So he was looking at critical statements made by reviewers or by writers about writers' work. He was modelling these so that you have a positive judgment is a positive connection. You also have negative connections as well, where work is being criticised. And he wasn't trying to look at the production of value. What de Nooy wanted to see was, if you model this network of positive and negative value judgments from one year to the next, from the structure of that network, is it possible to deduce the existence of literary movements and groups? And he found that to some extent it was. There have been some other studies which I've got on that slide. However, Bourdieusians have generally rejected social network analysis in favour of Bourdieu's favoured method, multiple correspondence analysis, and argued that field theory, I quote, allows for an understanding of structural inequality processes in more effective ways than those emerging from social network analysis or other network theories which seek to bypass those concerns altogether. Savage and Silver, 2013. I don't really want to argue with that, actually. I think that what Savage and Silver mostly have in mind there is actually active network theory. I'm definitely working within field theory, but applying social network analysis to it as a research methodology. So just to clarify, the approach I'm presenting doesn't replace multiple correspondence analysis or field theory. It aims to study interactions within a field, regarding them as determined by, but not identical to, the objective relations that structure the field. And it focuses in particular on those asymmetric relationships that Savage and Silver are worried will be lost, in order to focus attention on structural inequalities. Just to give you an idea of how structural inequalities might show up in a network, in the interest of digital research, I drew that with A little sort of theoretical model of how we might see the field of cultural production in terms of a network. At the bottom we have readers who are recognizing value in the work of particular writers. The writers, in turn, recognize value in the work of the writer's writer, who is at the top of this hierarchy, or would actually turn up in the center of the network if I used a spring model. The point is that the writer's writer is regarded within the field of cultural production as superior to the ordinary writers that ordinary people read, even though he makes less money. Circular relations of reciprocal recognition among peers can again be seen in this felt pen drawing, where we see some writers, let's say writers or artists or whatever, recognizing value in others' work and others not, some being unrecognized and being stuck on the periphery of the network. It's harder to see this sort of inequalities that arise in the network when we draw it like that, but it's still possible to measure the difference between a more core node and a more peripheral node using, for example, in degree. It's a very simple measure. In degree is simply the number of arcs that are coming into a particular network. So if we've got a couple of them on the outside with no incoming arcs, this one has got one arc, so coming into it, so it's got an degree of 1, and then you can see that these two are in a privileged position because there's 3 incoming arcs, so we can see those as being particularly valued creators. A more sophisticated measure of network centrality is eigenvector centrality. Eigenvector centrality it's a measure that was designed for analyzing centrality to a network, such that the choice it's better. This is used in order to measure centrality to a network in situations where being chosen by someone popular is better than being chosen by someone unpopular, which is the kind of situation that I would argue obtains in the field of cultural production. So we have this person up here has an eigenvector centrality of 0, even though they have one incoming arc. The reason for that is that getting, having your work valued by someone whose own work is not valued doesn't count very much. Whereas these two, they've also got just one incoming arc, but they're much more central because they're getting their incoming arcs from more central places. And of the two that have 3 incoming arcs, this one seems to be more central because this one is recognized by the other, not vice versa. Another such measure is PageRank. You might be familiar with this. It's the mathematical basis of the Google algorithm. PageRank is actually a fairly crude eigenvector measure of centrality. It's quite crude, but for the networks that I'm looking at today, it's actually perfectly adequate. This works in a similar way. You can see it's basically ranks things in almost the same way as the eigenvector centrality measure a moment ago. You might see that it appears to be giving these the same page rank, but actually that's because I've rounded everything to 2 decimal places. If it was rounded to 3 or more, you would see that it actually recognized this as the most central node, just as the previous node did. The point about PageRank, by the way, in the Google algorithm is that if your web page is linked to by a web page that's linked to by lots of other pages, that's supposed to indicate that your page is important to the web as a whole. So I'll be looking at a particular case study, which is what I'm calling the field of interactive fiction. Interactive fiction, for those of you who don't know, and most of you here are quite young, so you probably wouldn't even have heard of this. And those of you that aren't so young look like you are probably too cool to know what it is. This was, back in the 80s, an early genre of text-based computer game. A few names here of commercially successful pieces from the early 80s: Adventureland, Zork 1, The Hobbit, Twin Kingdom Valley. These have now been developed to a much higher level of sophistication than they were at in the early 80s by an online community of enthusiasts. And they're mostly distributed on a non-commercial basis, though not typically with open source files. This is sometimes regarded as form Beltran literature, though for reasons I probably won't go into today, I disagree with that. Here's a quick screenshot from one of those early works. This is Zork 1, a little screenshot from myself playing the game. you can see it's not a work of hypertext fiction. Okay? You're not clicking on links to get between different passages of prose. There is a world. You're getting a description of what that world is like. It's not graphics, it's a textual description. And to move around it, you don't use a joystick or you don't use a joystick or anything like that. You have to type in instructions. Okay. You type in instructions. Go west. Get sword and lantern. And the response. Sword taken, brass lantern taken, move rug. And here we shall now move on to a recent work. Now this is Mantula Marcanos Apocolis Syntosis. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly or if it even matters. An incredibly sophisticated work by Adam Thornton that was released a couple of years ago. This is an extremely interesting work, although I don't recommend you download and play it until you've had a chance to play some other interactive fiction, because it won't make the slightest bit of sense unless you've got familiarity with some other important works like Graham Milton's Curses. So to give a quick history, this all dates back to about 1976 when a computer programmer created what was effectively a Dungeons & Dragons simulator called Adventure. This was then expanded by another computer programmer called Don Woods. It was treated as public domain. Lots of versions of it were distributed free around university departments at the time. It was kind of reinterpreted or plagiarized by a number of commercial works like Zork 1 and Adventureland. Adventureland being the first computer game of any kind to be commercially released for a home computing platform. And these were commercially viable until the late 80s, when all of the companies that were involved in producing them either committed fully to producing other kinds of computer software or went bust. All were bought up and closed down. Which is what happened to Infocom, the brand leader, which used the term interactive fiction as a way of marketing text-adventure games beyond the computer games market, which at that time was largely limited to kids. So their games were available in bookshops, etc. A Usenet group called Rec Arts in Fiction was coincidentally set up at the end of the decade to discuss hypertext fiction, not these kind of games, but it was colonized by fans of Infocom games who basically took it over, and then that became the main forum for discussing what was by that point a commercially obsolete form of entertainment. The community around that Usenet group was invigorated by the arrival of a British mathematician called Graham Nelson, who released a programming language called Inform, which was a domain-specific language for producing works of interactive fiction. And he also released a game called Curses. From about 1995, annual competitions have been held to produce the best works of interactive fiction. And three particular authors whose names come up again and again in any discussion of interactive fiction, Andrew Plotkin, Adam Kader, and Emily Short, all made their debut on the scene between 1995 and the year 2000. There are numerous community institutions devoted to distinguishing better interactive fiction from worse, such as the one that I'm going to be talking about, which is the Interactive Fiction Database. That's a Web 2 site, arguably modelled on the Internet Movie Database, which was set up in 2007 by the creator of TAS. That's another domain-specific language for producing interactive fiction. Anyone can create a profile and then rate, review, or add information about works of interactive fiction. So one of the ways of publishing a work of interactive fiction now is to upload it to the Interactive Fiction Archive, create an entry for it on the Interactive Fiction Database with a link to it, and then people know it's there and can go and play it and review it and rate it. Most prominent members of the interactive fiction community appear to have profiles on the site, and many of them also rate and review works there. So this is a site on which I can observe producers of interactive fiction recognizing or not recognizing value in the work of other producers of interactive fiction. So if we take interactive fiction to constitute a field, then arguably we can we can study it in a way that's analogous to how we might want to study the field of cultural production. That's in contrast with something like library thing on the Internet Movie Database. There are professional There are movie professionals and professional authors on those websites, but they don't mostly use them for rating one another's work. My methodology involved writing Python programs to crawl the site, scrape the data, store it in a local database. I then had to clean the data because I found that there are a number of problems with it, largely due to the fact that this information... Really sorry, would you mind switching that to silent?
I'm actually trying to turn it off. I'm going to pull the battery on this one.
All right.
I am beyond...
Okay. Yeah, it's because it's a community site where anyone can upload information. So some of that information was incorrect in various ways, and I had to correct it. A few ethical notes. No personal data was collected. All the collected data was public. I had a few qualms about the fact that I was aggregating it in ways that are not done on the site itself. So there's the possibility that members of the interactive fiction community might misinterpret it and suppose that I'm arguing that some of them are worse than others. However, I think I can give them a bit more credit than that. This is an extremely sophisticated community. These are people who every year give an award to the work of interactive fiction that had the highest standard deviation in the competition. So they're not naive about stats. I mean, they know what they're doing. And I would argue that I have an ethical responsibility not to infantilize them. So I'm just going to go ahead and present this analysis, which includes some real names, or at least some real pseudonyms. Some idea of scale. At the time of data collection, which was early 2012, there were nearly 4,000 works on the site by over 2,000 authors, about 10% of whom had profiles on the site. Many of those that did not have profiles on the site, that's because they were what I would describe as historical authors. So they produced games in the 80s, for example, and they're not still around in the community. There were nearly 3,000 user profiles, most of which were inactive. 831 of them had been used to post ratings, of which there were nearly 13,500 on the site, which is, this is not big data, but it's quite large data by humanities standards, as it used to be until recently. One of the interesting factors I noticed immediately was that this large number of ratings was shared among just over half of the works that were actually on the site. So just under half of the works had no ratings at all. A quick graph here of the history of interactive fiction as implied by interactive fiction database data. What I've done here, the solid line, that's the number of works that were released each year. And the dotted line, which starts off above it, is the number of ratings on the site for works released in that year. The reason this is interesting, so you can see it starts off, you've got quite a large number of ratings for the early works. There's not many being released at that time, but they're being rated quite a lot because it's historically interesting. The graph of ratings then tracks the graph of games. In reality, of course, there are more games released than this, but many of them simply haven't been included on the site because they're not regarded as interesting. But then what you notice right here is that the number of ratings actually drops below the number of games. So from this point onwards, more games are being released and then recorded on the site than are actually being rated on the site. And that corresponds to the collapse of that brand leader infocom. So you get a sort of dark age which goes on. You've got games being produced at roughly the same rate, but they're being reviewed and rated at a much lower rate. Until here in the 90s, which is when Graham Nelson appears with his informed compiler. And that's when you start to get the post-commercial games that the community today is mostly interested in. So the number of ratings shoot up. You can see you've got the first interactive fiction competition. 2000, you've got a number of very notable works released, so you've got a real spike in the number of reviews and ratings. I would also argue that in quite a crude way, you can get a suggestion of canon formation on the interactive fiction database. What I've done here is scatter plots. The crosses represent individual works. Up here we have the average rating that they've been given on the site, and along there the number of ratings that they got. What you can see is that works do not get large numbers of ratings unless they're also being considered to be good. Okay, so you can see that's what's going on up here as a sort of canon of highly rated and frequently rated works. The one right over here is Photopia, which is one of the most talked about and valued works of interactive fiction by Adam Cada. Well over 200 ratings, almost all of which are extremely positive. You get a massive, you can't really see it because of the nature of the scatter plot, but you've got a massive concentration of them down here, which have got very few ratings, which are quite low. So now to some graphs. Just to explain what you're about to see. These are graphs in which an arc, which looks like an arrow, from, let's say, from node A to node B, indicates at least one high, that's 4 or 5 star rating, by A for a work of which B and not A was an author. So I wasn't letting people rate their own works. Well, they're allowed to do that on the site, but I wasn't counting them in my analysis. First we'll see a full network with all of these arcs, so it's all of the ratings represented. Then a reduced network where I've removed all of the nodes that don't have any incoming arcs recursively until you've got a situation where every node is receiving an arc from a node that is also receiving an arc from somewhere else in the same network. And then reduce that further to a network of what I call circular recognitions, where I've removed all nodes that are not found within cycles. And then finally, I've created an undirected graph of directly reciprocal recognition. So it's a graph of cases where one producer has rated positively the work of another producer who has rated the first producer's work positively. So there is the full network. As you might, well, as those of you with some familiarity with social network analysis are probably thinking to yourself, that's already, you can already see that this is a core-periphery structure. My initial plan for this research, by the way, was quite different. I thought I was going to look at clusters, and then I was going to try and compare, using techniques of corpus analysis, I was going to try and compare the language that was used in the reviews that came in particular clusters in the network. When I actually saw what the network looked like, I realized that I was barking up the wrong tree. It didn't make sense to approach this data in that way, because we don't really have clusters to any great extent. What we've got is this enormous concentration of value in the middle of the graph. Around the edge, the nodes are color-coded. The grey ones are people who have not created any works on the site. The other nodes, they're coloured according to what development system these creators primarily use for interactive fiction. The green nodes, which you can see are quite dominant, especially in the core, are creators that primarily use inform. And the cyan nodes use TAS, another one that I've mentioned. Yellow nodes, of which there's very few, use Hugo, which is a little used but highly regarded development system for interactive fiction. These pink nodes represent creators who use the programming, the domain-specific language ZIL, which is the proprietary programming language of Infocom. So these are Infocom authors. They're not still members of the network. They're not rating anything. They've gone on to do other things. But their work is very highly regarded by people that are on the network, so they're mostly here in the core. Red nodes, on the other hand, are using Adrift, which is a graphical text-adventure game or interactive fiction creator. You can, by pointing and clicking, you can create works of interactive fiction. Adrift tends to be discussed with dismissal, if not contempt, by users of the systems I've just been talking about. There are interesting reasons for that, which I can go into if anyone cares. But the point I want to draw your attention to now is that these are not found to any great extent within the core. Okay? So you can see that the core is dominated by the users of particular development systems. Dark blue, these are creators of interactive fiction that don't primarily use any of those systems I just mentioned. And most of them are scattered around the relative periphery of this graph, most of them having received no more than one incoming arc each. So I've recursively removed all of the nodes that received no incoming arcs until I was left with a network where every node was receiving an arc from another node in the same network. Again, we've got something like a core periphery structure. You have a lot of the fanning out around the edge. You have a lot of nodes representing authors whose work has only been recognized by one other person. You can see that the red adrift authors are confined to one particular part of the network, and they're not particularly well connected. Right here, in what seems to be the core of the graph, we have the core of the network. We've got, again, this dominance of the green inform nodes, the cyan and TAS nodes, and these pink ZIL nodes. And we have a couple of quite well-connected yellow nodes representing these Hugo authors. There are not many of them, but they're well regarded. Well, right over there, in the far right, you can see two inform authors who only recognize each other's work. Reduce that again, so here we've got only those nodes that are in cycles, directed simple cycles. You'll see that the structure of this graph is very similar because it actually underlies the other one that we were looking at a second ago. Again, we have we've got the adrift using authors right out here on the edge. Connected, interestingly, one of them is the one that rates the other one. We've got, you can see a quite well connected Hugo using node here. Most of this, though, is inform. A couple of TAS users right in the center. And one user in another system, which is someone who only very unusually did well in the interactive fiction competition, despite the fact that they didn't use informal TAS. So it's here that we can really see people who are, they are receiving recognition from other people that also receive recognition in turn. Now, here's the directly reciprocal recognitions. Undirected graph. You can see there's a couple of isolated components. Here, that was the one on the far right of the graph, and from that one up here, which isn't really connected anywhere else. We've got one large component here, primarily composed of inform using authors. Right at the center, we have Emily Short. It's absolutely no surprise that she should be at the center. She was not only one of the most frequently rated authors on the site, she was also one of the most prolific raters of other works on the site. But she she seems to hold this network together. If you take her out of there, actually, a large amount of the network will fall apart. So, moving on from there to some attempts to estimate value by calculating centrality, I'm going to show you a table with in degree and page rank for nodes in both of those, well, in the full network and the reduced network. I would argue that by comparing these figures, we can get an idea of the distinction between popular writers and what I call writers' writers. A few caveats. The interactive fiction database is just one site. Value will also have been produced in interactions elsewhere. Although this is a particularly popular site within the community, it's not universally preferred. For example, most of Andrew Plotkin's ratings and reviews are on a different site. So many of them, in fact, that the reason I couldn't use it was that it was totally dominated by them. Each measure involves assumptions and can produce counterintuitive results under certain circumstances, and the construction of the network itself also involves assumptions. So this is not an objective measure of how valuable particular authors are considered to be within the network, although I think it's quite indicative. We've got the top 5 for each of those two networks and by each of those two measures. The thing I want to draw your attention to is that the top 3 authors in each case are Adam Cato, Emily Short, and Andrew Plotkin. This is, as I knew from my sort of observational and interviewing research beforehand, the right result. If it hadn't been them, something would have been wrong with the measures. What's quite interesting, though, is the way that these names change order as you move across this table. Because on the left, we've got, this is the whole network, yeah? So including everyone, including the ones that didn't author anything or that didn't author anything that was valued by anyone else. That's the first 2 columns. On the right, we've got only those, we've got only ratings from people who are highly rated in turn. Also, the first column, the third column are both in degree, which considers everyone's ratings to have equal value, whereas the second column and the fourth column is using page rank, which is a kind of eigenvector measure. So that accords more value to ratings from highly rated authors. So it's, what we're actually seeing is sort of, as you move from left to right in the graph, you're seeing figures that reflect more and more closely the preferences of people who are closer to the core of the network. And what you find is that in the first column on the extreme left, you've got Kia, who has a huge lead over Emily Short, who then has a much smaller lead over Andy Plotkin. And this lead gradually disappears and is reversed by the time we get over here. So among the more central authors, Emily Short appears to have more status here. So you could argue that she is more of a writer's writer than he is from the point of view of this network. Although, as is quite obvious from this, they could all also be regarded as writers' writers. They are still the three most popular authors by any measure. And in fact, what was one of the interesting things I found was that the more and more I restricted the network, the greater the preference for the works of these three was. So the more recognized you are as a producer of interactive fiction, the more likely you are to love the work of at least one of these three. By the way, this one here, they would have all come up with equal in degree, if not for the fact that Emily Short rated both Andrew Plotkin's and Adam Kaye's work on this site, whereas neither of them used this site to rate work. So if you actually take ratings out of this, then you get the same figure of 20 in degree. So a few findings. This is basically a classic core periphery structure. Uses a particular development system's dominant core. And three particular authors are most central to network evaluations. This could be applied to other areas of cultural production, historical cultural movements. Three that I'm interested in are the Georgians, the Modernists, and the Bloomsburyites. These are all coteries of authors who valued each other's work, promoted each other, and encouraged one another. It could also be used for studying contemporary literary culture, looking at reviews. Something you might have noticed looking at the reviews section of newspapers is that often reviews will be written by the person who will be given a book to review will be someone who is an author in their own right. So you can see how authors rate each other's work there. Also, social media sites for cultural production. SoundCloud, which I'm collaborating with another academic on a study of. Also fanfiction.net, which some of you might be familiar with. On these sites, you can see how producers have rated one another's works. And it could also be used in the sociology of academia itself. There is at least one academic field that relies very heavily on social media and uses Twitter as a sort of post-publication peer review system. And of course, talking about digital humanities, so you could produce a social network diagram of how value within the digital humanities is produced through tweeting and retweeting blog posts. Of course, I don't want to forget that the IFDB is not a Bloomsbury drawing room. There are real dangers in talking about subcultural fields such as this, as if they were equivalent to what a sociologist would call legitimate cultural production. I would argue that they're distinguished by having a different relationship to educational institutions and to institutions of what Delaney calls reproductive culture. Basically speaking, being highly rated by other authors of interactive fiction is not going to get your works onto the high school syllabus 50 years from now. And that's where I come to the next part of my talk, which I will flash through very quickly because it's all work in progress. Looking at propagation of belief in value beyond the fields in which it's produced. This happens with legitimate culture. It doesn't happen with subcultures. That's one of the distinctions between them, and that's one of the reasons why it's much harder than making money out of a subculture. There are a lot of institutions that propagate belief in value beyond the field of cultural production. The publishing industry itself, it has to sell books to people who are not also writers and publishers. Journalism, criticism, cultural news, cultural prizes. These all exist to instill a belief in the value of culture in people who do not produce it. So I have a quick network model. Back to my felt tip pen. We can start off with the artist. That's where what Bourdieu critiques as the charismatic model of cultural production begins and ends. And we can think of the artist's value being propagated out into the wider world through an institution such as a gallery, especially a public gallery like the Tate Gallery or the Museum of Modern Art. By exhibiting an artist, it is telling the public that this artist is valuable and allowing them to disseminate that value further. The reviews might, exhibitions may be commented on by newspaper critics, for example, as well. These newspaper reviews will be read by people within the field, but also by people beyond the field. It's a way of propagating belief in the value of particular works. So we could see from institutions such as galleries and newspaper criticism, belief in the value of cultural works propagates out to the rest of us in society. Where does this value come from? It's essentially produced within these struggles that take place within. Okay, where would you find data to study this kind of thing? Essentially, you'd be looking for evidence not only of where people locate cultural value, but also for evidence of which institutions and individuals have influenced them in their location of cultural value. So you could be looking at diaries, letters, other historical documents, seeing which critics it was that were influential, for example. Which galleries could have that power to make people think that this is really an artist worth looking at? You could also, through interviewing or looking at social media. You can mine social media for things like Facebook likes, tweets and retweets. Also, there are specifically cultural websites like Library Thing, of course. In fact, mining social media for this sort of thing is almost too easy. Look at this tweet. When I had the idea of doing this research a few months ago, I just started looking by doing an ordinary search through Twitter web interface, and there was masses of stuff, and this was the very first thing that came up. It's not in itself. Agree with Guardian review of Liechtenstein at Tate. Whatever else it is, stunningly beautiful is my parting thought. So it's told us not only there's the artist Liechtenstein, the gallery through which he experienced the works of Liechtenstein, the review whose opinion of that exhibition he endorses. He's even given us a link to the review, which makes our job incredibly easy. Another thing that's quite nice, notice the favourite there, which already implies some sort of further propagation of value beyond this particular tweeter. I've got to be careful in interpreting this, because of course a favourite can mean lots of things, but I just wanted to show you how much potential there is for researching this sort of thing. Problems there are plenty of. Production and propagation of value in social media is not a proxy for production and propagation of value. Generally, it is a subject in its own right. The fact that somebody is doing that on Twitter doesn't mean that somebody else is doing something analogous in real life. Also, there is still an enormous requirement for traditional data gathering, archival work and surveys in most areas you might want to research. The very idea of creating a social network of evaluations involves certain working fictions. Like the idea that an arc is always an arc, and that if it's weighted, that we never know how much weight to give it. For example, public and private evaluations may have very different status. If the established artist says to the newcomer, "You're very talented," the newcomer may feel encouraged, but that doesn't necessarily produce value for the newcomer's work in the way that an endorsement from the established artist on the front cover of the newcomer's book would do. If the established artist says something like that at a party, let's say, how do we rate that? Is that public? Is it private? Who heard it? Does it matter who heard it? So the procedure always relies on and arguably reifies interpretations, so it's very important to use it as a way of exploring what's going on and not suppose that you actually objectively studied the entire process. And there I should finish. There's my contact details and affiliations.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Any questions? Oh, Stuart, you were first.
Very, very interesting. What I was sort of getting at or sort of struck me in the earlier part of your talk was that a lot of these sort of fictions, interactive fictions you're talking about, in a sense move beyond the concept of page, as in the printed page.
Oh, yeah.
And then you were sort of talking later on about the social media and all this sort of thing. So I was wondering, as the kind of units of text, the scale of the texts that we are dealing with producing become much smaller, do you feel that influences of external events and external narratives become sort of stronger, or delay does affect these trust chains in some ways. I'm thinking the most retweeted tweet ever is 3 words long, 4 more years by Barack Obama. So I mean, there is an immediate context there, which clearly gave that tiny text a significance in the context that it would otherwise have. I wonder if you think these kinds of approaches might take us forward in that kind of thinking.
Possibly. That's a good question, actually. It's a really good question. I'm only just starting Twitter research really, so I haven't considered these things in full depth, but I think there's also that, yes, it does cause ideas, well, messages can be much more widely disseminated if they're short. You really quickly decide that you agree with it and you want your followers to hear it, so you retweet it. On the other hand, there's a sort of depth of engagement that's lost then. And I wonder a lot of the time what it is that people think they're communicating when they retweet something. Twitter also seems to lend itself to extremely polarized arguments. People fall very quickly into opposing camps that are kind of tweeting and counter-tweeting. I think probably partly because these tweets are so short, they lend themselves to the sort of the quick riposte. But again, it's not always entirely clear what's meant by these things, and you sort of feel that you agree with it, so you retweet it, but will other people understand it the same way that you did? So there's a lot of danger here, because it's the shorter the texts get, the harder it becomes to attach some sort of meaning to them, which you can use in your analysis. I think that's the problem that I'm getting at there. But these are things I'm definitely going to have to address, so thanks for bringing it up.
Simon, do you have your mobile off? No. I thought I had to say that now.
It's something that I have no idea why it buzzing, even though I turned it off.
That's fine, no problem.
I was very interested by the methodology that you were adopting, and then you were kind of positing that it could maybe go further. And I was talking more about the scale issues there in terms of, because in one case you've got a quite constrained community, and in another starting to expand out into not very necessarily very self-aware, effective communities in the same way. And how it scales and what are the challenges?
Well, I'm only starting to deal with that now. These are real challenges. One of them is, the great thing about having that particular community was that I could do a whole population study. I haven't got the entire interactive fiction community, because some of them use other sites to rate work on. But I have got I've got the whole subset that uses that site. So I don't have to worry about things like sampling bias. I can be quite sure of who these people are, what kind of things they mean by particular statements. All of that is going to disappear when I'm working with something like SoundCloud, especially where you've got comments being made in multiple languages, most of which I won't be able to read. So there's a lot of problems there. On the other hand, in some ways things get easier because you have a website like SoundCloud, which has quite a nicely developed API, which actually makes it much easier to get hold of the data that I'm interested in. But there are all sorts of issues to deal with once you try and scale these things up. It's a methodology that I think scales quite nicely. It's just that the problems scale as well, particularly if you're using something like eigenvector centrality as a measure. Because one of the great thing about eigenvector centrality is that it reproduces this intuition that an author of valued works has a more weighty opinion within the community than someone who is not an author of valued works. But on the other hand, it also means that if any kind of error creeps in when you're dealing with those authors of the most valued works, the effect of that is magnified enormously. Issues that came up, for example, one author of there were two individuals that I spotted who were the author of works that had been rated highly by a number of other people. But each of them had only given a positive rating to one author in turn. And by the nature of eigenvector measures, including PageRank, that means that that one author who receives that positive rating must be more central than the other one, which is completely counterintuitive. And these sort of problems will be magnified when you're looking at something like SoundCloud. I mean, let's say, I don't know, but let's say we have the SoundCloud account of some really famous DJ who just uses it for promoting his or her work, and then by chance he or she once happens to give favourite somebody else's work, and then never does it again, not because they don't mean to, just because they forgot about anything important to them. That will have an enormous effect on the network that I produce. But it doesn't necessarily reflect something that's really there in the cultural field that I'm trying to study. So, and things like that, you can spot them when you're only dealing with a few hundred people. It becomes really hard when you've got a million accounts that you're looking at.
There's a concern certainly in the social networking environment, that people are trying to scoop those values on there, and trying to create artificial sense of importance.
Yeah.
Whether that's by just getting lots of followers, or whether that's by getting lots of retweets, or whatever it is. Maybe there's certainly been occasions in the academic field where, say, someone who is in the process of being a postgraduate research person is seen as being far more influential online than maybe the eminent professor in the field, because they are that more present, active, engaged, etc. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm saying it's an example of how the medium can distort.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that can happen with things like citation analysis. I mean, my research group, for example, we had an event a few years ago where someone, I won't say who, was encouraging us all to cite each other's work. And then one person commented, perhaps we should all agree that everyone in the faculty should once cite the work of everyone else in the faculty, and then we will suddenly get the highest impact factor in the entire world. So it is possible to game all of these systems. One of the interesting things about this methodology that I was using, though, is to a certain extent it filters out some of that. Because I know that there are sock puppet accounts on IFTD, for example, and somebody could use these to give high ratings to their own works. But unless you go to the trouble of actually creating work authored by that sock puppet, and then finding other people who are able to give it high ratings, or doing that yourself, having created other works, it's actually much harder to build this system.
It's a bit like when you go on Amazon, you're only supposed to review the book you've read.
Yes, yeah.
Then one question before I end. Have you ever tried to actually compare this with a kind of traditional review system of books? So Amazon reviews, or you said now the problems about SoundCloud, but of course SoundCloud is about sound, yeah? So in that sense it's a bit different, or even reviews on library sites or something like this.
I haven't tried yet. I've looked into the possibilities of doing it, and like I said, I mean, it's an interesting way of studying. It's easier to study consumption that way than production, because there are not that many authors who will openly go onto Amazon and rate works. I'm sure many of them do it secretly. There are not many that do it openly. One of the things with SoundCloud is that you do get people like DJs and folk musicians commenting on each other's work. That's not so prevalent on Amazon or library thing, but I'm looking into the possibility of doing this kind of work. What question over here?
Might consider blurbs, but...
Blurbs?
Yeah. But I was wondering, I was actually really intrigued by the rankings that you had, and moving from left to right on the screen, this idea that it became more of a sense of the restricted field. But, and that actually in each of these cases, the top three are the same. I mean, we know that in fiction, for example, Dan Brown is not going to be anybody's top three favorite writer if they're actually a writer, and that actually you had a tremendous amount of overlap that I don't think would be necessarily predicted by the Borderian model of autonomy versus neuron. I have seen something very similar in comics publishing, where in the case of comics, basically in subfields of comics production where it's very male-dominated, the most prestigious works will also be the best-selling works. It's only in those subfields that are gender equal, where the prestigious work will be male, and the non-prestigious commercial works will be very heavily feminized. So I was wondering if something was going on in gender there, because I noticed the one took Emily.
She's not the only woman on this.
Yeah, but if there was a gender thing playing into that, because that might explain why you're not seeing quite as much spread.
I think the reason why I'm not seeing quite as much spread is because this is quite a tightly constrained subculture. To some extent, the whole thing functions like a field of restricted production, and there isn't a field of mass production. So I'm only talking relatively when I say it would be ridiculous to talk of Adam Cage as being popular also. But I mean, he has actually written a young adult novel, which was apparently successful. But as an interactive fiction author, you can't be popular because there just aren't that many people that are interested in playing. And to be interested in interactive fiction, there's a lot of demands placed on the creators of these things. They have a tightly coded, well-written, with a lot of awareness of the history of the field. But actually, in order to understand one of these works, you have to have a lot of awareness of the form itself, which I think will play into certain kinds of comic books, for example. The gender thing, I'm just not sure about. There is a lot of quite overt evidence of gender dynamics around Emily Short. She was. Something is there, but I'm not sure it's going to be possible to analyze it easily, given that she has such an extraordinary status in the community, not only as the most high-profile female member of the community, but also as the sort of glue that holds an awful lot of the community together, because she's producing works that are very highly valued. She's doing a lot of work reviewing other people's work, bringing the work of unrecognized authors to general attention within the field, also promoting works of interactive fiction beyond the field. She writes a lot on indie games websites, reviewing works of interactive fiction and getting other people to play them. So her role is so extraordinary that it would be difficult to separate out any single part of it.
I think add to this and ask your opinion on it. With the emergence of Twine in the last 2 years, and we can debate quite some detail whether that's interactive fiction or not. But in the last week, the interactive competition shortlist came out, and 30% of the games were Twine pictures. And this is something that's easier to use, and there's very much a feminist and queer movement within that. So within the kind of wave, so there was the kind of commercial wave and then inform, and now Twine. How do you think that is going to change the kind of core periphery of the community?
Well, it's an interesting question because you've got... Twine is actually, in many ways, something quite different. You remember I talked about how Adrift was looked down on because it makes it too easy to produce interactive fiction, but at the same time, it doesn't provide... doesn't necessarily provide the experienced user with all the affordances that the more difficult to learn systems do. So. And Twine kind of exaggerates that even more. It's much easier to use than Adrift, but it's also much more limited in what you can produce. The results don't actually formally resemble field text adventure games, so they look like something else. What I think we're seeing there is an influx of people producing things that wouldn't have been entering works into the competition before, but we've also probably got people voting that wouldn't have been voting before. So we're relying on a new community there. And I think that's probably going to lead to... It's going to lead to something interesting going on, let's say. It might be comparable even... I've talked about digital humanities as a network that one might study in this way. And there are interesting things that have happened there, where you get the old guard hardcore digital humanists who've been doing it for years, and then you have an influx of new people from disciplines like media studies. And that creates all sorts of anxieties, because are these really humanists? Are they just muscling in on something? It's, these are not debates that I want to intervene in any way, but I think it's quite interesting what happens when you get something changing that brings people into a community that were not there before. I don't think it will necessarily blur the boundaries. I think it might possibly cause schisms or attempts to redefine what interactive fiction really is, which is of course what we've seen in digital humanities as well.
Which is sort of where I was thinking, why do you see this interaction between something being culture and subculture? Because if you take the whole propagation system, why you see get something pushed out as being subculture? Why the over popularity of a certain part of it? That makes sense. So if you're getting this influx of people who are using Twine, you could argue that the original culture is actually going to become a subculture of that culture. Because it's getting pushed out by this kind of Google paper.
So it would be interesting. I mean, it might be, I said I was looking for clusters in the network, and I didn't really find them. I just found this core periphery. It might be that we end up with finding a rival court. And then we will have the clusters where I can analyze and see if they're actually using different language to evaluate work. I think that's how it will show up in the network, as a possibility of a rival core.
I think we are already getting to ends ready, so I collect now the last question before I allow myself. I have the privilege. Okay. In a way, I think this points now to this one too. Would you not say that not all nodes in this are equal and not all arcs in this are equal? So even if you measure it, let's say, with the number of incoming and outgoing arcs, the degrees of these, there will be different people. So if Barack Obama tweets, more people are listening. Yeah. So what is the impact on? In a way, I guess that's what also Bourdieu or the people before. And there's not just one type of capital. There's all kinds of capitals that are influencing the kind of decision I make on reading something or reviewing it. Yeah? So what would be your argument to say to counteract this kind of criticism?
Well, that's what I was that was what I was alluding to, possibly too briefly, at the end when I was talking about problems.
Yes, indeed.
The fiction that an arc is always an arc, and that if weighted, we know how to weight it. Because what we're actually talking about then is the need to interpret particular actions as arcs within the network. And how do we interpret them exactly? It's then that you start to have problems. And it's not that they're not dealable with, it's just that they're dealable with through working assumptions. So you would say, I will treat this arcs from this node as having more value for the reason that. Someone could then challenge that and say that they shouldn't have. But at least if you're, like in thematic analysis, if you're clear about what your coding system was, it's a replicable form of analysis. If you just do it all in your head, it isn't.
No, I don't want to neglect this as a potential in that approach at all. I just wanted to point out to this problem, which you also, of course, mentioned yourself. And I think it also comes through in your scatterplot, actually, because the scatterplot, of course, doesn't have a time dimension in it. Yeah? So where you would say, if I read on Amazon, I don't know anything about interactive fiction, if I read on Amazon that this book is not reviewed well, I will not open it. Yeah? So in that sense, it's no wonder that you have clusters on top and then clusters on the bottom, because it's, of course, not just everybody enters into this world in the same way. Yeah? So.
Oh yeah, but it's interesting the way that inequalities get reproduced like that.
Yes, indeed. And then there's a more like a Bayesian system than a kind of node system, yeah? Anyway.
Yes, it's an interesting point.
Thank you very much.